We have found with our outlaws in this series that there is either a whole lot of information or very little information about who they were. Tom Smith is one of the characters in history that there was actually a whole lot of information available about him because he was involved in two of the most deadly feuds in Appalachian Mountain history. He would also be the only man to legally face the gallows in Breathitt County, Kentucky. While he is a very savory person, he was honest in his confession as he wanted to go meet his maker with a clean slate. Accused and confessed to the killing of 8 men, Smith would eventually be tried, convicted, and face the gallows on June 28, 1895, for the murder of Dr. Rader. However, Smith's life was not cut and dry, as a series of events would lead him to his life of crime. He would be remembered as one of the bloodiest men in the Appalachian Mountains. His story will be told by many newspaper reports, his confession, and what is written about him in the genealogy pages. We will try to give an accurate portrayal of his life as it is recorded in history. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Who was Tom Smith? Thomas Smith was born October 13, 1859, at Troublesome Creek in Perry County, Kentucky, to Richard and Mary Polly Kelly Smith. Richard Smith was a prominent minister of the area at that time. Tom Smith married Emmeline Combs on February 24, 1881, in Perry County, Kentucky. Emmeline was the daughter of George David Combs and Mary Baker. They would have several children together. Matilda Smith Combs, 1881 to 1960, Bud Smith, 1885 to 1924, Maggie Smith Fitzpatrick, 1886 to 1956, John Smith, 1888 to 1927, Cody Smith, and Edgar Smith, 1895 to 1975. It seems, according to the book The Hanging of Bad Tom Smith, that he was a songwriter. He was often called upon to sing for crowds and social gatherings as he would write his own ballads and songs. According to the Yay Pot website, quote, his fame as a singer followed his infamous deeds as if the two belonged together. Even on the day of his hanging, Smith was harassed to sing for the masses gathered in Jackson. Sheriff Combs has much trouble in the jail all during Smith's last week. Scores of persons came hoping to persuade Smith to sing. Very seldom, however, in fact, his last week did Smith sing. If the crowd was in the mood for songs, Smith certainly was not. This was his last week, songs came hard. But if in a rare occasion Smith rose to sing, all in the jail hurried to his calls, standing near the bars but not too close, unquote. Only one song was recorded shortly before he went to the gallows that he wrote and sang, but can also be found through the Yay Pot source. Quote, don't grieve after me. First stanza. I'm going to walk through the valley in peace. I'm going to walk through the valley in peace. Oh, when I'm dead and buried in my cold, silent tomb, I don't want you to grieve after me. Second stanza. I'm going to lay down my life for the Lord. I'm going to lay down my life for the Lord. Oh, when I'm dead and buried in my cold, silent tomb, I don't want you to grieve after me. Third stanza. I'm going to leave all my friends in peace. I am going to leave all my friends in peace. Oh, oh, when I'm dead and buried in my cold, silent tomb, I don't want you to grieve after me. Last stanza. I don't want you to grieve after me. I don't want you to grieve after me. Oh, I am dead and buried in my cold, silent tomb. I don't want you to grieve after me. Tom Smith. One has to wonder what Tom Smith's life would have been like if he had gotten his chance for fame and fortune peddling his songs instead of living the life of crime that he did. Early life of crime. Smith's parents would die when Tom and his brother Bill were still young. When Smith was only 5 years old, their father, Richard, was murdered and their mother, Polly, died not long after. Orphaned and thrown to the winds of chance, both boys were shipped to any family member in eastern Kentucky that would take them in for a time. They were never settled very long in a home and given very much guidance by a parental figure. This life of rough boyhood would carry into Tom Smith's manhood. His reputation of petty larceny, delinquency, and aimless desire began to grow. Many would call him a dreamer that held no compunction to actually turn a good day's work. It is this behavior, without course correction, that would lead into a life of crime. The following comes from the source, the Birmingham Age Herald, Birmingham, Alabama, April 21st, 1895. It can also be found in several newspaper sources, including the Pawtucket Tribune, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, April 28, 1895. Quote, owing to the poverty of his father, he received no education. From his earliest boyhood, he was classed among the wildest boys of the neighborhood. He possessed a daredevil nature, and he was always getting into trouble. He began stealing when a mere boy. Unquote. The French Eversole feud. When the fighting first began in Perry County, Kentucky, according to the Yapot source, Smith found himself with the Eversole faction. They were the strongest of the two factions, as they were against the tyrannical way the French faction was taking land for the coal mines. This would change early on into the feud, but his first skirmish in the feud would happen when he was only 20 years old. According to the same sources, quote, when 20 years old, he engaged in the first serious fight in town of Hazard, the county seat of Perry County. It was on election day, and several of his friends were being fired upon by their enemies. Smith had no weapons, and he began throwing stones. He knocked one man down with a large stone and secured a musket from him, with which he seriously wounded Eli Combs and several others. From that day of the fight, he seemed to have a burning desire to shed human blood. Unquote. But all was not well with the relationship between the Eversoles and Smith. They would turn on him and try to have him face the gallows. It seems, according to the Wikitree website, that the Eversole faction brought in an indictment against Smith for horse theft. Evidently, Smith had stolen the horse of Joseph C. Eversole's brother-in-law, Ira Davison. It seems that several friends of Smith testified falsely that he was not guilty of the crime. Through this action, Smith was acquitted of the crime and did not go to the gallows, which was the penalty of the time. From that moment forward, Smith swore vengeance upon them. Also, according to the Wikitree website, Smith committed larceny against the Eversoles shortly after being acquitted of the crime of horse theft. James Davison, who was an Eversole man, was robbed of his watch by Smith. Davison tried to bring Smith to trial. This effort failed when Smith threatened the witnesses with death if they should testify against him. In retaliation for bringing the charges against him, Smith set fire to the house of Davison's mother. He would catch the eye of the French faction of the French Eversole feud. We will only cover the parts of the feuds that are contained in his confession, as we are covering these more extensively in the Appalachian feud section. Smith was definitely a lieutenant for the French faction. While he states in his confession that he was never a hired man for Benjamin French, he did receive clothes and was given money and other things that he asked for. Many of the murders and ambushes that took place in the feud for the French faction was by the hand of Smith. Joe Hurt. Hurt's murder is not often counted among the deaths of the French Eversole feud, but it is the first death that Smith does confess to. Smith and Hurt did know each other because they had worked for the Eversole faction at the same time. According to the sources, the Birmingham Age Herald, Birmingham, Alabama, April 21st, 1895, and the Pawtucket Tribune, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, April 28th, 1895. Quote, in 1887, he, being Tom Smith, decoyed Joe Hurt, a young man, to his house and shot him dead. No one saw him commit this crime but Hurt's wife and little children, and although an effort was made to bring him to justice, it proved abortive. Unquote. According to the Daily Public Ledger, Maysfield, Kentucky, June 29th, 1895. Quote, the first one was Joe Hurt. He came to my house above Hazard, and I shot him with a needle gun. Unquote. This death helped Smith move up the ranks of the French faction. It would not take him long before he became the trusted member of the faction and would rise to be one of the lieutenants. Joseph C. Everso and Nick Combs. While in our video concerning these two murders do have the witness statements from those that were present at the time, in this section of the story, we have the perspective of one of those that took part in the ambush and their view of what happened. According to the Daily Ledger, Maysfield, Kentucky, June 29th, 1895, quote, Joe Atkins and I lit out for Joe Everso, and Joe shot him and Nick Combs. I shot at them as they fell and then robbed Everso's body of $30, unquote. According to the sources, Birmingham Age Herald and the Pawtucket Tribune, quote, on April 15th, 1888, Tom Smith, his brother Bill, Joe Atkins, and Elkanah Kernet learned that Joe Everso, the leader of the Everso faction, was to pass along a certain road that day, and they secreted themselves 5 miles from Hazard. The road leads from Hazard to Hayden, Kentucky. Their action was a result of a plan conceived of by the chief of the French faction and 2 or 3 of his trusted advisors. Without suspecting any danger, Joe Everso and a young man named Nicholas Combs approached the ambush. When they arrived opposite of the place of the concealment, 3 Winchesters and a shotgun belched forth, and Joe Everso fell. Young Combs pitched over his horse's head, bleeding from 3 wounds. Tom Smith, springing from the bushes, was soon at the side of Combs. The boy had fainted, and believing him dead, Smith stooped over the body of Everso and rifled it. As he finished searching the pockets of Combs, the latter opened his eyes and said, quote, "Oh, Tom, why did you do this awful deed?" Unquote. For answer, Smith took aim at Combs' head. The boy who was dying looked at Smith in the face and in a weak voice pleaded, quote, "Oh, Tom, Tom, don't shoot me any more, for I am killed and I am dying fast enough." Unquote. Smith, with his pistol leveled, said, quote, "Nick, I can't afford to leave any witnesses." Unquote. As the last word was uttered, he pulled the trigger, and the bullet entered the boy's right temple and came through to the left temple. For this crime he was tried before a magistrate, Zach Fugit, as the county judge, a brother of Joe Everso, was afraid to hold court. The county attorney was also absent, and as Smith had spirited away the witnesses, Squire Fugit could do nothing but release him. Unquote. We have covered more about what happened to the death of Nick Combs and John C. Everso in the French Everso feud. However, we do have from his own words that the story was given by Judge Combs and other witnesses do line up with what actually happened and who was responsible for the crime. Shade Combs. Soon after the death of Everso and Nick Combs, John Campbell became the new leader of the Everso faction. It is thought that the reason for Combs' death was because he had asked for permission from John Campbell to start ambushing certain members of the French faction. The hunter soon became the hunted in a game of cat and mouse, and Combs lost. According to the Roots website, while standing in his yard saddling his horse, Shade Combs was shot and killed surrounded by his children. Thomas Smith, along with several other accomplices, were arrested. However, he was never taken to trial and did not face any charges for the murder. Robin Cornett. We have also covered this murder in our Appalachian Feud series. However, like before, We have this perspective of the person who pulled the trigger. According to the Daily Public Ledger, Maysville, Kentucky, June 29, 1895. Quote, Jack Combs and I killed Robert Cornell. It should be Robin Cornett next. He was cutting saw logs when we came upon him. I shot him first. We killed him because he belonged to the Eversoles. Unquote. According to the sources, the Birmingham Age Herald and the Pawtucket Tribune. Quote, several other friends of Eversoles were notified to leave the county or die. Among these was Robin Cornett, who lived just beyond Hazard. He owned a very poor farm on which he was unable to make a living. On this account, he worked during the winter getting out logs. One day, while he was so engaged, and while in the sight of his own door, and surrounded by his 4 little boys, Tom Smith, Jesse Morgan, and Bob Prophet surrounded him and from the bush shot him to death. Smith was indicted for this crime, but evaded trial by having the case put out from the court to court and by forfeiting his bond. Unquote. It seems that Smith used the court system of the time to his advantage to get out of the murder charges. Even though he was indicted, he would never face charges for this murder. The Battle for Hazard and the Death of John McKnight. We have more of the Battle for Hazard, Kentucky in the French Eversole feud section. However, this is from the perspective of Tom Smith and why he killed John McKnight. Quote, during the session of the Perry County Court in the fall of 1889, the French and Eversole factions met in the streets of Hazard. Henry Davison, one of the Frenchmen, and Wesley Whitaker, an Eversole man, got into a dispute. Davison ran into Jesse Field's house, from which safe retreat he fired on Whitaker. Then the fight became general. It was begun about 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, the second day of the court. James Davison went to Lott's Creek, where the French was in waiting with plenty of men and ammunition, he having expected a battle. French men quickly marched into Hazard, arriving there at 1 o'clock Wednesday morning. Tom Smith and his brother Bill led the French forces. Their voices could be easily heard above the cracking of the Winchesters, their war cry being, quote, hurrah for Fort Finch! He is our king, and we will follow him into hell. Unquote. It is estimated that no fewer than 2,000 shots were fired in this fight. The French forces, with Tom Smith in the lead, held on till about 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning. After the fight was over, it was found that Jake McKnight and Ed Campbell had been killed. Campbell fell from a bullet from Joe Davison's gun, and McKnight was killed by Tom Smith. The French faction did not lose a man. For this 18-hour fight, all of the Eversole and French people were indicted, and their trials, except for that of Smith, were removed to Winchester. Later, Smith's case was removed to Pineville, where he was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to the penitentiary for life. His cause was reversed by the Court of Appeals, and the indictment was finally filed away. Unquote. It seems that a man named Ed Campbell and his friends were having a wonderful time at a place named Graveyard Hill that overlooked downtown Hazard, Kentucky. They were drinking moonshine and having fun playing poker. Campbell decided to add to his fun by standing beside of a tree shooting his pistol. There was a store at the upper end of Hazard owned by Joe Davison. As soon as Davison heard the shots being fired, he looked out from the rear window of the store to see Campbell waving around his still smoking pistol in the air. Davison then grabbed his Winchester rifle, took aim, fired, and Campbell fell to the ground dead. As for John McKnight, there had been a huge battle in Hazard, Kentucky between the Eversole and French factions. The Eversoles had used the courthouse as a fort of safety in firing upon the French faction. This soon became a trap as Tom Smith and Jesse Fields went up on Graveyard Hill and set up a crossfire. Before dawn, John McKnight and another man attempted to cross the street for safety. Tom Smith opened fire upon them. McKnight died instantly. According to the Daily Public Ledger, Maysville, Kentucky, June 29, 1895. Quote, John McKnight was the next man I killed. I shot him in the fight at Hazard. Bob Brothers was also shooting at him at the time, and it may have been he that killed him." Unquote. Ambrose Ambergy. According to the sources Birmingham Age Herald and the Pawtucket Tribune, quote, "After killing Combs, Smith continued bushwhacking friends of Everso. He and his brother Bill secreted themselves in a cellar of a house in Hyndman, the county seat of Knott County, and in broad daylight assassinated Ambrose Ambergy. This crime occurred in 1889." Unquote. There is not a lot of information about this murder other than Tom and Bill Smith were in the cellar when they ambushed Ambrose Ambergy in broad daylight. Ambergy was a part of the Everso faction in the feud. The burning of the courthouse. According to the same sources, quote, "In the latter part of that year, everything was quiet in Perry County, and the French having removed to Winchester, Kentucky, the grand jury returned several indictments against Smith for his crimes. This alarmed the murderer, and, in gathering a crowd of his friends, he visited Hazard one dark night and set fire to the Perry County courthouse. All the indictments and court records were destroyed except some documents that were saved by Coleman Reed of Mount Sterling. By threats and by spiriting away witnesses, Smith once more evaded the law. After the courthouse was burned, a reign of terror prevailed in Perry County. Men who had denounced his crimes left the county." Unquote. This was a dangerous time to be in the area if you were on one side of the feud or the other. On July 4th, 1890, the French faction was not about to face charges of the feud. So on that fateful night, incendiaries were used to bring down the bastion of justice in the mountains. Most of the records were saved from the utter destruction of the explosion and fire. However, all of Tom Smith's official records were destroyed. The court would not be deterred and began holding court sessions under a tent and called it Blanket Court, and indicted men would face their charges in Winchester, Kentucky. Smith indicted. From the following two sources, even though all of the records of Smith's previous crimes had been burned in the Perry County Courthouse fire, he would not go free. He would still face charges for the murder of John McKnight and would be convicted on those charges. According to the Yapot source, quote, "The governor had to send a militia to Hazard in order that court might be held. For the part that he took in this fight, Smith was indicted, and the case was removed to Pineville, where he was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to the penitentiary for life. The courts of appeals reversed the decision, and the case was never tried again." Unquote. According to the Wikitree website, Smith did face charges for the murder of John McKnight. Quote, "Following the Battle of Hazard, Smith found himself yet under another indictment, specifically relating to the killing of John McKnight, and after being convicted was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, after B.F. French had intervened by having his case brought before the Court of Appeals, they decided to reverse his sentence and had the indictment filed away." Unquote. So once again the scales of justice had tilted, and Tom Smith was once again free to roam the mountains of eastern Kentucky. For a short time, about 4 years, he would work and live life quietly until one day he decided to get drunk on moonshine. Smith wounded. According to the Pawtucket Tribune and the Birmingham Age Herald, after Smith got out of jail for the goings-on in Hazard, Kentucky, he went on to Breathitt County for a little while. While he was there, he laid low enough to live a life of a libertine and worked in one of the largest department stores in eastern Kentucky named the Mammoth Department Store. There, he worked without much disturbance with the law. This was mainly due to the fact that Judge James Harless, leader of the Harless faction of the Harless-Cockrell feud, owned the store. This would all change one night. He would get drunk and try to take over the town of Jackson, Kentucky, and paint it red. Quote, "Last September he went to Jackson one afternoon and was soon under the influence of white whiskey and began to try to run the town. When Marshal H.C. Hurst, Jr. and his deputies attempted to arrest him, He and several of his chums opened fire on the officers. They returned the fire promptly. A bullet from Marshall Hurst's pistol struck Smith's left arm and shattered the bone into splinters. It also severed an artery, and Smith came very near to bleeding to death. This was the first and only time he was ever wounded, unquote. It was during this time that he was healing from his gunshot wounds that he would be privy to the assassination plot of Judge Josiah Combs. Plot to kill Judge Josiah Combs. According to the Daily Ledger, Maysville, Kentucky, June 29, 1895. In Tom Smith's confession, he stated the following, quote, I was at Just Fields and heard Fulton Finch, Joe Atkins, Boone Frazier, Mrs. Fields, and Jesse Thorpe make the plot to kill Judge Josiah Combs, and afterward heard Atkins say that he fired the shot that killed him. French offered me money, but I never hired to him. Yes, he gave me clothes, unquote. It seems that even though Tom Smith was involved in the plot to kill Judge Josiah Combs, he could not participate because he was wounded. He told his sister in the newspaper reports that the reason he was wounded came from an attempt to escape from arrest in which he was shot in the arm. He also told her while he was never hired by French, he did give him clothes, money, and other things, and all he had to do was ask for them. While this confession was not considered to be legal testimony against Benjamin French, it did cause him to be arrested for the murder of Judge Josiah Combs and to be sued by his widow for causing the unlawful death of her husband. While French was able to free himself of these legal woes, it must have been a shock to him to hear the confession of Smith and laying the blame upon him. Catherine McQuinn. During his stay in Breathitt County, Smith became intimately acquainted with Catherine McQuinn. They seemed to be of kindred spirits, as she was now considered to be a scandalous woman. Here is how their love began. Catherine was born on May 15, 1847, and was married to Jeremiah McQuinn in 1869. Their marriage seemed to be a very rocky one. As the story goes, according to the Yapot source, Mrs. McQuinn caught the attention of a store clerk of Day's Brothers Mercantile. They both had their mutual attraction and began an affair. When their love affair was discovered by Mr. McQuinn, he went stark raving mad. Because of this, Jeremiah McQuinn was sent to the asylum for treatment. This did not sit well with the young man, who later ended his life over the affair. Shortly after the death of the young man, Smith and McQuinn began living together as man and wife. This was even though Smith already had a wife and 2 children. According to the Yapot source, Smith gave the reason for leaving his family as, quote, she took up for the Eversoles and I had to leave her, unquote. But this woman would do far more than just live with Smith. She would be the cause of Doc Rader's death in 1895, according to Smith. Death of Doc Rader. It was well known that Doc Rader had not touched a drink of liquor in months, and that he was the leading doctor in Jackson, Kentucky. He was also well known to carry a large sum of cash on his person. McQuinn and Smith hatched a plan to rob Rader of his money. Sometime in the last of January of 1895, Smith would complain of having symptoms that was something close to having fits. Having fits in Appalachian is something like having epilepsy or some type of seizure disorder. Smith convinced Doc Rader that he needed to come to his home and watch his symptoms all night long so that he could be cured of the ailment. Rader agreed to come and brought along with him a jug of moonshine whiskey on February 4, 1895. Smith had already started drinking, and Rader found that he was unable to treat Smith for his ailment. So he began to join him in drinking. Because it had been a few months since the last time Rader drank, it did not take long for him to become very drunk. McQuinn and Smith were also very drunk. Rader stayed the night as planned and was going to leave the next morning. Sometime early on February 5th, Rader was found with a bullet hole in his heart. According to the Wikitree source, quote, in the morning after the slaying, Sheriff Brett Combs arrived at the home and was greeted by Smith, who, when questioned about what happened the night before, denied remembering anything, saying that he was too drunk to remember. Sheriff Breck and Smith had been friends since childhood, when Smith and his brother Bill had spent time living with them after the death of their parents. However, upon discovering the body of Dr. Rader, Sheriff Breck arrested his childhood friend as well as Mrs. McQuinn as suspects in the murder. Unquote. According to the Daily Public Ledger, Mayfield, Kentucky, June 29, 1895, quote, "Yes, I killed Doc Rader. We had been drunk together several days, and that night he tried to get Mrs. McQuinn to go after Louise Southers, a girl that he had been coming to see. She failed to find the girl, and Rader got mad at her, and she told me to kill him or he would kill me. I was too drunk to know any better, and I shot him twice. Nobody asked me to do it." Unquote. It was found at trial that Mrs. McQuinn had ordered Smith to do the killing, which he did. She would later take the blame for the shooting at her trial. The trial. The trial of Thomas Smith for the death of Dr. Rader did not last long. At first, Smith thought that he would be able to wiggle out of trouble, as he always did in Perry County. However, there had been enough trouble in eastern Kentucky, and the people of Breathitt County was now determined to make an example of Smith. The people of the county hoped that by the conviction and execution and the sentence, that the name of the county would improve, as well as justice would finally come back to the area. According to the Pawtucket Tribune and the Birmingham Age Herald, with the belief that one party could blame the other might get them out of trouble. Quote, "Both Smith and Mrs. McQuinn were arrested and tried for the crime. Mrs. McQuinn testified that Smith assassinated Rader while he slept, and Smith testified that Mrs. McQuinn shot him. It seems that each jury believed the testimony they heard, for the 12 men who tried Smith were only there 3 minutes in deciding that he was guilty, and that his punishment should be death, while the jury that tried Mrs. McQuinn had been out for only a few minutes when they returned a verdict of guilty and fixed her punishment for imprisonment for life." The New York Sun. Unquote. The trial only lasted a few days, with Judge D.B. Redwine presiding. The jury came back with a guilty verdict, and the gallows date was set for June 28, 1895. Catherine McQuinn was convicted as an accomplice to the murder of Dr. Rader and was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was later pardoned by Governor William Bradley in 1897. The crowd. In the 1890s, in the Appalachian Mountains, public executions were seen more as a social gathering or a public picnic than a place to witness the justice system administering punishment. The public execution of Bad Tom Smith would take place under such a carnival condition. According to the Daily Public Ledger, Maysville, Kentucky, June 29, 1895. Quote, 200 armed guards patrolled the town, and Sheriff Combs had 50 armed guards around the scaffold. A great crowd of Smith's friends came to town Thursday night. 100-gallon jugs of whiskey were shipped into town by way of the Lexington and Eastern Railroad, but the officers of the road shipped it back to Lexington Friday morning, thus preventing a great deal of drunkenness. A large number of women and children were present, and it seemed more like a fair or a big picnic than a hanging. The scaffold was surrounded by a 7-foot fence, so that the crowd could see Smith make his statement, but could not see him after the drop. Curtains were arranged to be pulled around the top of the scaffold post before the black cap was put on and the drop of 6 feet. According to the Yapot source, the number of men and women attending the execution was somewhere between 4,000 to 5,000 people. Baptism. One of the most interesting events surrounding the execution in the Appalachian Mountains is the baptism. This is to be taken solemnly and soberly, and considered one of the most important and significant events in the entire execution. Before Thomas Smith would step over into the hereafter, like so many before him had done, he requested to be baptized. It really is not known as to the motives behind Smith's request. Some people thought that this was a genuine confession and atonement for the terror that he helped to inspire in the mountains. Others were not so convinced, as they thought that this was the reason behind Smith's request was to give B.F. French an opportunity to rescue him. On June 28, 1895, at 7 a.m., the date set by the court for the execution, Smith was escorted by Sheriff Combs and jailer Sinners with a heavy guard, 400 yards to the North Fork of the Kentucky River. There, Smith was met by Reverend Stephen Carpenter, Reverend J.J. Dickey, as well as other ministers to perform the service. Thousands of curious onlookers lined the banks of the North Fork River as Reverend Stephen Carpenter opened with a prayer. It was so moving that Smith began to weep, and the people in attendance began singing a baptismal hymn. Smith then walked into the water, where he was immersed by 3 preachers, and when he was raised out of the water, gave the crowd a smile. Upon his returning to the jail, Smith would stop and shake hands with those who held out their wishes of him of good luck and Godspeed. According to the Daily Public Ledger, quote, Jackson, Kentucky, June 29th. At daylight Friday morning, the crowd began to assemble to await the hour of Bad Tom Smith's execution, and by 7 o'clock, 1,500 people were on the ground. The doomed man rested well Thursday night, and ate a hearty breakfast of chicken, pork, and bread, drinking a cup of coffee and a half a pound of milk. At 7:30, Sheriff Combs, with a strong guard, led the prisoner to the river, 300 yards distant, where he was baptized by Reverend Stephen Carpenter, assisted by Reverend Thomas Kelly, a cousin to the condemned man. The scene was very impressive, as the prisoner walked into the water with the ministers, who sang impressive songs all the way. After his baptism, he was led back to the cell to await the hour of execution. Unquote. Telegram to the Governor of Kentucky. According to the same source, not everyone was convinced that the baptism was on the up and up when it came to the intentions of the condemned man. Quote, Bad Tom Smith tried to evade the law at the last moment. The time set for the execution was 11:20. But just before the hour arrived, Smith told the sheriff that while he had been forgiven for all of the crimes he had committed in the French-Eversole feud, he had not been forgiven for the killing of Dr. Rader. He therefore begged Sheriff Beck Combs to give him more time, and that official postponed the execution to 1 o'clock. This was a ruse on the part of Smith to gain time and get a respite, for he had sent his brother Bill to the telegraph office and had this dispatch wired. Quote, Governor John Young Brown, Frankfort, Kentucky, would like a few days' time, as I am an orphan boy and have no friends. Tom Smith. Unquote. At 12 o'clock the following telegram was received from the governor. Quote, Tom Smith, Jackson, Kentucky. I must decline to interfere. John Young Brown. Unquote. Smith was very nervous while waiting for this reply, and he was unable to stand or sit still. He walked back and forth in the jail constantly. Occasionally he would stop to sing a song, in which 3 mountain preachers who would have been with him for several days would join. Unquote. When Sheriff Combs became aware of the message being sent to Governor John Y. Brown, he made the following statement to the crowd after deciding to postpone the execution for a few hours. According to the Wikitree source, quote, at 11:30 a.m., Sheriff Combs decided to postpone the execution until 1 p.m. in wait of a reply from Governor Brown, and sent one of his deputies to the gallows to address the crowd, who exclaimed in a loud voice, quote, the execution is postponed until 1 o'clock so that the condemned can save his soul. Unquote. This announcement caused some irritation to the crowd, who dispersed for lunch, but soon reassembled, desiring to secure a good vantage point near the gallows. The clamor to witness the hanging was so palatable that the mass of spectators had assembled on a shed roof, causing it to collapse. However, nobody was injured in the incident. Unquote. According to the Daily Public Ledger, the drop fell at 1:45 and Smith died in 10 minutes. Promptly at 1 o'clock, Smith was taken to the gallows, unquote. When Tom Smith climbed the gallows stairs, he made his confession about the killing of 6 men that he was sure of, and 2 men that he was unsure of died at his hands or at the hands of another man. He then made another statement to the crowd about how he came to the place that he was in now. According to the Wikitree source, quote, "Friends, one and all, I want to talk to you a little before I die. My last words on earth to you are to take warning from my fate. Bad whiskey and bad women have brought me where I am. I hope that you ladies will take no umbrage at this, for I have told you the God's truth, to you, little children, who were the first to be blessed by Jesus. I will give you this warning. Don't drink whiskey and don't do as I have done. I want everybody in this vast crowd who does not wish to do the things that I have done and to put themselves in the place I now occupied to hold their hands," unquote. As he uttered these words, the hands of every spectator in the vast audience was raised upwards, and Smith continued by saying, quote, "That is beautiful. It looks like what I shall see in heaven. Again, I say to you, take warning from my fate and live better lives than I have lived. I die with no hard feelings towards anybody. There ain't a soul in the world that I hate. I love everybody. Farewell until we meet again," unquote. According to the Daily Ledger, quote, he was surrounded on the scaffold by his spiritual advisors, and his sister, Quilly Smith, was with him. She kissed him goodbye and begged him to be prepared to meet her in heaven, and when she went down off the scaffold, Smith knelt down and made a long prayer with a loud voice. He then sang a hymn and prayed again, and then the rope was adjusted and the black cap drawn. Just before Sheriff Combs pulled the lever that released the trap, Smith screamed, quote, "God save me! God save me!" unquote. According to the Daily Ledger, quote, at 1:45 the lever was pulled and Smith's body fell 6 feet, breaking his neck. He was pronounced dead in 7 minutes, unquote. According to the Yapot source, quote, one of the touching incidents of the execution was the action of the widow of Dr. Rader, who was present with her 3 little children and Dr. Rader's brother. Just before the drop fell, she held her little ones up at arm's length so that they could look over the crowd and see the man who murdered their father, unquote. The grave of Thomas Bad Tom Smith. According to the sources, the exact location of Tom Smith's grave today is unknown. Although his body was taken from the scaffold and entrusted into the hands of his family, and 500 attended to the Car Fork in Knott County. However, in 1976, the Car Fork Creek Lake Reservoir was constructed and the bodies in the cemetery had to be moved. Most of the bodies ended up in the Car Fork Memorial Cemetery in unmarked graves. However, there is a marker in the Vicco Baptist Church Cemetery, which bears Tom Smith's name and the epitaph, quote, "Bad enough to be hanged, not too bad enough for God to save," unquote. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Outlaws. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.